Yes, and we are live. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As you know, this is the place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. Today's topic: what does it mean to be white? And I preface it, what does it mean to be white in America, right? Now, this topic today came about from a conversation I was having on Twitter, right? Something happened. I think a guy did something. He was being accused of being a white supremacist. It turns out the guy is Mexican, and people were saying, "Oh, he can't possibly be a white supremacist because guess what? He's not white. He's Mexican." And I'm like, "Hmm, is Mexican a race? I mean, can't Mexicans be white? Are Mexicans people of color?" I did check out Mexico and the racial composition of Mexico, and I found that even a majority of people in Mexico self identify as white. So it didn't make any sense to me that, Mexicans can claim to be white and people can say, no, they are not white. I mean, Hispanics are usually seen as not white. So I posed the question to Twitter. I asked, what does it mean to be white? I mean, we all know what it means to be black, at least in the social context. And we can draw it back to the at least in America, you can draw it back to the one drop rule. It's sort of a racist rule which is still being used today. I mean, that's why someone like Meghan Markle and Barack Obama will be considered black, even though they are mixed race people, right? So we know what it means to be black socially. But what does it mean to be white? How can you tell a white person from any other person, right? I asked this question on Twitter, and it was very interesting that for a while I didn't get any responses, and the responses I was getting, uh, they didn't make much sense to me. After a while, one of the white guys, the racialized white guys that was, you know, engaging with me, he said something. He said, "You know what? I'm white and I've been white all my life, but honestly, I really can't tell you what it means to be white. I really can't define what white is, right?" And it just struck me. It was so interesting and so astonishing, right? So this is the question that I want to explore today. Here with Ogie, and obviously both of us are black guys, and I want white people to call in, people who are racialized as white to call in. I'll put the link in the chat. I want people who racialize as white to call in and tell us what it means to be white. How did they know they are white? How did they come about? How but what are the metrics for judging what is white? What are the metrics for saying this person is white? And I know some of you might say, what are two black guys doing talking about what does it mean to be white? Well, it's a free world, so we can talk about anything. And come on, white people when they got to the Americas first, they discovered the land and they named erroneously named those the people there. They erroneously named them Indians, and it was very clear that they were not in India. They thought they were in India. It was very very clear. Guess what? They still call them Indians till today. So if the white man can be that, if he can have that hubris, please entertain our hubris today in talking about what it means to be white. So, Ogie, welcome to the conversation. How are you doing?
Hey Charles, yeah, thanks. I'm doing good. Um, Obviously a pretty interesting topic, I guess. Unfortunately, I mean it's kind of sad that we couldn't get, um, I guess, just more so the opinion or ideas of individuals who are racialized as white to give your honest take. Um, So I guess yeah, I'm basically just here to exchange ideas. Obviously, in terms of like the somewhat ambivalent answers that you've gotten, I've also experienced the same. But let's be very clear. Like these terms, black and white, are they're fundamentally racial identities. That's what they are. And if you begin to unpack it, what you would find for the most part is that these are identities that most people are unable to articulate beyond their somatic features or skin color. Now, the challenge with that is that when you press, when you actually ask an individual to take a physical account of your somatic features, your skin color, to say does it actually match the descriptive you're using, a lot of times what you get is no. And then there's always often that realization that we kind of don't really know what this thing means. So yeah, I'm here to have a conversation and see if we could hopefully get to the bottom of this, but I doubt we will.
Yeah. So that sets a very good foundation and good tone for this. And we have Chris here, and from all indications, let me not assume, but I would say Chris is white, right? Am
Yeah,
I right?
I'm
Good,
white.
Hi, Chris.
Hi,
good. So, Chris, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Welcome to the show. So, I'm hoping that you'll be able to help us answer this question today. This very, very burning question, right? So, maybe let's start with what's your conception of race? What do you think race is, right? And racial categorizations before we dive into what does it mean to be white. I mean, like I said earlier, we know what it means to be black, at least in the social context, right? Having at least one, having some African ancestry in you makes you somewhat black, at least in America. So, what's your conception of race itself?
So I would say there's two ways. There's one of two ways to look at it. And first of all would be the biological way, and one is pretty simple. It's just like the level of melatonin in your skin. So you to me look black, I to me look white, and that's pretty simple. Then there's the social construct, which seems to be and has been more and more and more increasingly discussed and contemplated, and that's the social construct. And what is it to be, I think, socially white, and what is it to be socially black? And I think you just kind of get involuntarily lumped into one of the two biological categories, and then it's kind of like the social construct you are ascribed to and you follow personally. And that's like just kind of setting the table. That's not really an answer. So can I kind of answer your question with a question?
Okay, so try. I'll see if I can answer it. If it's something I can answer, so try.
Okay, so there's a woman. She's black. She's, I guess, kind of a social activist, and she writes a lot of articles for Time Magazine and other stuff. And she talked about being an advocate. She's on the staff of a reputable university, and she asked a similar question in a classroom that was full of the class was directed towards like racial awareness and racial equity in the United States. And she said, when I ask somebody who's black what it means to be black, they say, well, I look in the mirror and I see black skin and I'm black and I live it every day. And it's like kind of forced down my throat. And so it's my lived reality. And I think maybe somebody who's Hispanic maybe answered it too. And here's, maybe I'm not answering it with a question, but like just if somebody white were to say, I look in the mirror and I'm white and it's my lived experience every day, I think the response to that would be like, you're awful. Like, that's an awful answer. It's your lived experience. Like, how unaware of your existence are you? But anybody else who's not white can say it. And that's like super curious to me.
So you think that a test of whiteness is what you're able to say and get away with, or what you're able to say and not be able to get away with? You think that's a test of what it is?
No, not at all. I mean, if you ask me what it is to be white, it's just to be white, right? I don't have, fortunately for me, I don't have some horrible experience attached to my skin color. And I guess I'm aware of that because in more recent years, it's a much more socially aware thing and conversation, but it doesn't like mean anything. My heritage is all European, If you ask me what it is to be Scottish, I'm second generation offspring. I can tell you what that is because I have stories from my grandfather and my father on what that means, but I don't connect like being Scottish to being white. You know what I mean?
Mm. But you describe yourself as a white guy. So when you say I'm white, what exactly are you referring to? What are the metrics
I
of
didn't
white?
describe myself as white. You kind of made me pick one.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I made you pick one. So if you were to choose, right? People have referred to you as a white guy. I have
Right.
referred to you as a white guy. What do you think I'm saying that makes me think you are a white guy?
The color of my skin.
Oh, the color of your skin. Okay,
That's
cool,
it.
cool.
And again,
So,
I would cop to being in the fortunate circumstance of not having had a negative experience attached to my skin color. But to me, it's not really any more complicated than that. But if you ask what is the coincidental thing behind being white, which is again mostly Scottish, but then some German and Polish, I could tell you stories about that. But my stories wouldn't be related to the color of my skin. It would be the heritage.
mm. So do you think that someone who has, okay, let's take a comedian, for example, Trevor Noah. Do you know Trevor Noah?
Yep.
Oh, so he's a South African comedian. His father is Swiss German, right? His mother is African, right? Is he white by that, by his heritage? Would you call him white?
Well, no,
Okay, why?
because I think at least in the United States, you're trained that like if you're not like Lily White, then you're not white.
So
Yeah.
what do you mean by lily white when you say lily
Like
white?
like you're white, you're so white that it doesn't appear that you have any African American or Asian or Latino or any other no melanin in your skin tone. You know what I mean?
So it means that for you to be white, you have to be pure,
I think it's just a
purely
skin.
European.
I'm sorry, say that again.
For you to be white, you have to be purely European.
That's not my definition. That's what I would say the answer is in America based on everybody else.
Mm, that's interesting. That's an interesting answer. So, um, black people get to be from any shade like myself to someone as light as Meghan Markle, right? Or even Sean King, right? But for white people, they have to be strictly, I mean, strictly of European heritage. It's have to be strictly of European descent. So, that answer. Of course, I knew that answer. So it's not surprising to me. But I just wanted to know if people were going to admit that is the metric for determining what is white, right? That you have to be of pure European heritage, which is not a bad thing in itself. But
Well,
now,
that's not my answer. That's
no.
your answer, right?
Okay, so what's your answer? What's
The
your answer?
color of my
What
skin,
would your answer be?
the color of my
The
skin,
color of your skin,
and
which
and
is
I'm not
due to what?
sufficiently dark to be anything other than white.
So,
Does that make
what?
sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. But what informs the color of your skin? What informs you to be this light? There is something that underpins your being this light for you to be referred to
Well,
as a
that
white
gets
guy.
back to my first answer, which is just biological differences, which is the level of melanin in your skin. And
Which is
here's
also
an
traced
interesting
to your
story.
heritage,
I'm sorry, go. I'm sorry.
which is traced to your heritage, right?
Well, I don't attach it to that. It's just to me, it's coincidence. It's just
Mm.
biological coincidence.
Do you know Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan Tate?
I don't think so.
Damn.
Oh yeah. He's the fighter guy who's in jail right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I know who he
So
is.
what race would you say he is?
He looks to me like maybe like Eastern European, like maybe Greek or maybe a little bit of Middle Eastern mixed in, something like that. I don't know if that's a race. To me, that was more of like a
So what race would you call him? If he's Eastern European, right? What race would you call him?
I wouldn't. I don't have an answer.
Based on the color of his skin. If
Well, he's not
you know,
white. He's not black. I don't have an answer. See, that's where I don't
mm,
like. If you said, "What does it mean to be white?" It 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 doesn't really mean anything to me. It just happens to be the color of my skin. Andrew Tate
so
happens
it's
to
not
be slightly pigmented.
so he's not sufficiently light enough to be classified as white.
If you made me answer that question, I would
Yeah.
say yes, I would agree with that. But that's not my qualification because I think attached to that is some sort of judgment, and I don't care. I don't care that your skin is dark. I don't
No,
care that his skin is medium. You know what I mean?
so can we take the judgment out of this? So there is no judgment. We're not
Okay.
attaching any judgment to any of the answers. We're just trying to understand how people judge what whiteness is, right? So don't hold back from your answers because you feel maybe there's an element of judgment. So please, so in your mind, right? For the fact that it's a little bit pigmented, right? Even if he has two European parents, even if he has parents that are of European heritage, right? Maybe he has some Scottish in there, or maybe he has some East African, some Eastern European in there. For the fact that he's a little bit tan, if that way, he won't be seen as white.
Um, if you forced me to answer that, I would say yes, he's not white. But if you ask me to say what's the difference, if you like put you and me and him all next to each other, and you said to me, what's the difference between these three men? I would say that guy looks like he is of African American descent. That guy looks like he is of Middle Eastern or Eastern European descent. And that guy looks like he's of Western European descent. To me, I attach it to geography, not to skin color.
So, so we're getting somewhere. So it seems that white correlates with European and correlates much more strongly with Western European, right? And if we're going to drill it further down, probably to the Germanic peoples, right? The Anglo-Saxons and the Germans, the Scandinavians, right?
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Mm. So before I ask you any further question, let okay jump in. What do you think of the conversation so far?
Yeah, obviously, I just wanted to commend you, Chris, obviously for taking this opportunity, obviously, to dialogue. And as Charles has said, obviously, no judgments. But I was listening to, I think one of the first comments you made about, I think was the example you gave about why is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, why was it easier in the instance where I think you said, so a lady who was racialized as black said, um, she that when she wakes up in the morning, like she views herself or sees herself as black, but that would kind of be unacceptable for someone who's racialized as white to say. Did I did I paraphrase correctly?
Well, she asked her class that.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't her, but yeah, everything else is accurate. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things or that I basically we want to touch on just more so from I would say from like kind of like a semi historical perspective in terms of the reason or the reason why it almost seems like when it comes to white racial identity as white, it's kind of it's easier for something. And I'll give an example maybe to buttress my point. Imagine two stores or two shops donuts where two stores two cafes, right? Now imagine on one store you had as a sign, black owned business, right? And then imagine another store where you had as a sign, white owned business. which do we think is going to be more um, which business do we think is going to be easier for people to approach without having any weird preconceived notions on?
I well, I don't think you can answer that question one or the other. I think that people are going to go into the store that they most think that the people are like them are like.
No,
So
no, I'm saying if if you whether if you're going to a store and in the storefront you could see just in bold black owned business
right.
or white owned business, which do we think it's in our present climate or in history it's easier for people to go into that there isn't any stereotypical like baggage on?
I think those stores would be, for me personally,
Yeah.
I would look at those stores equally as I would kind of vilify both of them. Like I'm
Sure.
kind of not interested in going in either one because they're both saying we're exclusive.
Yeah, actually that would pertain for me, but maybe that was a bad example, but what I was trying to highlight is, you know, when it comes to white racial identity in the history of that concept, it's always been seen as this hyper aggressive identity, right? And you could either take it back to, white race, the institution of white race coming from post Bacon rebellion to Jim Crow, right? It's always seen as this hyper aggressive racial identity built on a hierarchy where others are kind of subservient to it. So I think just from that historical perspective, and this is kind of my understanding when I approach people or when we have the conversation of, is that the people racialized as white are not too they're not too, what's the word, they don't necessarily present whiteness as kind of like a forward facing identity. As a matter of fact, it's kind of more, if you ask them, sure, if you ask them to explain it, they don't know, compared to other racial identities which seem more forward facing, right? And this is just, basically coming out of the like the historical context in which those identities were formed. Okay, so when you ask that question, Chris, in terms of why is it socially acceptable for someone to say, oh, my black, I experienced the world, my blackness or whatever, and another person can't say, oh, I experienced the world, my white identity. I think part of the reason is because of that historical framework.
Oh yeah, I understand why one is not acceptable and I think I understand why one is acceptable and the other's not. Well, but what? Yeah, it's complicated actually. Yeah, I guess I just don't get why somebody, if you can say, it's my lived experience, I don't think about it. And that's okay for one race and not for another. That's what I don't get.
Okay, so like that black being a lived experience.
Yeah, because by default, every individual, I don't care what you are, white, black, blue, Christian, Jewish, atheist, whatever, an individual's lived experience is by default their lived experience, period. You don't have anything else. So if you just say, I don't think about it, and I'm moving on, why is that okay for one person and not another?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good point, but I would, often, because I personally, I don't see any value in racial identities, and I'm kind of more in line with, aspects of your view of seeing identity through an ethnic lens. And even like when you said, you spoke about like your heritage through I think you said Scotland. Like my best mate
Yeah.
is Scottish, and he he doesn't see himself as white, but he sees himself as very Scottish, right? So and this is the reason why I always think like it is important to have kind of like an understanding of practically of what white is. And the only way I feel it's easier to situate it in its proper context is to understand it for what it is. It's a racial identity. And with racial identity, you're always dealing with quantitative constructs, right? So, like, what do you say, for instance, Chris, someone of Scottish ancestry, like, what do you have in common with the Ukrainian, right? Or what do you have, or do you get what I'm saying? What does Chris, the American, the US citizen, have in common with a Yugoslavian? You see? But
Mm.
if we're to lump it all under this homogeneous category of white, right? Whereby, your values, your, history as a person is it's all lumped in one, then for me it becomes more of a numbers game. Because now I'm not seeing you, I'm seeing the collective, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I look at it very much the same way.
Fantastic. So back to Andrew Tate and his brother. So let me just give you the context. Both of them, they're mixed race. Their father is African American, and their mother obviously is white. So that's why they have the quote unquote Eastern European look. So, what would you consider Eastern Europeans as? Would you consider them as white?
Me?
Yeah, Chris. Yeah, Chris. Would you consider Eastern Europeans as white in a racial sense?
So my answer to that would be, and this is kind of a non-answer, I'd say that's up to them.
Okay, so what do you think people outside seeing Eastern Europeans, what do you think what racial identity would most people project onto Eastern Europeans?
See, here's where it gets tricky, or simple, depending upon how you look at it. If you're Greek and you're as white as I am, you're white. If you're Greek and my departed wife was Greek and she was pretty dark, I think most people would see her as non-white, and they could be next door neighbors in Greece and have, lineage that goes back as far as one another. So again, to me, it's more of a biological how much melanin is in your skin, I don't care. So that gets back to the numbers game, right? Where that's kind of up to them.
So what about Arabs? What would you classify Arabs as?
I mean, I think culturally in the United States, most Arabs are more white-ish. But again, I'm not like judge and jury. I don't care.
There's no judgment here. It's just perception. What's your perception, or what do you think societal perception is as regards this group of people, like Arabs?
Okay. Now, like you said, now we're getting somewhere. I think it kind of depends who you ask. I think if you ask somebody who, like me, doesn't care, I think you'd get an answer like, I don't know, I haven't thought about it. Just to make this quick. And if you ask like a white supremacist, I think they'd say they're not white. So I think it kind of depends who you're asking.
So
does that make sense?
It does. It does make a lot of sense. So can we put ourselves in a white supremacist mindset, right? So if a white supremacist is too no, don't run away, please. Don't close up. So what do you think is going through the mind of a white supremacist when they are making that classification? What do you think is going through their mind in terms of determining who is white and who's not white?
I am so not comfortable answering that question.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah.
It would be first of all, it would be a supposition. And I think you
Yep.
could probably guess as well as I, maybe better, right? You're not American though, right?
No, I'm not.
Yeah. So I think somebody in who's black, and I think any American could probably make that supposition as easily as me. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm telling the truth or not, but I'm happy to say I don't know any white supremacists. So I couldn't give you a good faith and or honest answer. I would just be guessing.
What's your best guess? Give me your best guess.
I don't want to. I don't want to touch that, man. That's radioactive. What's your best answer?
Well, I don't know. That's why I'm here.
I don't know. I have no idea.
I
Well,
mean, you know
it's
what, Stanley, the supremacist worldview or point of view has always been couched by this notion of of purity, right? Of this undiluted purity, which is a myth, and most of their assumptions is basically trying to tie what they think is this undiluted um, genealogical chain to a time period where they feel that such purity existed, which is a huge conflation. So I remember. I
Can
don't
I
know.
interrupt real quick?
Sure, yeah.
Who's they?
The white supremacist, the
Okay.
white supremacist worldview. I
Okay.
remember. I think it was. I forget the name of this the popular Spencer. Spencer's. I think his last name is Spencer.
Spencer
Uh,
Tracy.
no. He was banned from a couple colleges in the states. I know his last name ends with Spencer. Something. Richard Spencer. Yeah, I remember. I remember there was this speech he was given, and he was talking about uh, we're descended from the Anglo-Saxons, which is which is a funny assertion if you understand or know the history of the Anglo-Saxons, and you know how the diverse groups that lived in Den Britannia. So I think the summary is that there's this myth making about some form of purity descended from this group that that I believe gives them this sense of of being unmixed. So that's basically what I'll say. But it's all myth. It's all nonsense.
All right. Tricky. Welcome. So we've been trying to define what white is. We've had some very interesting responses and answers from Chris so far, which I really appreciate, Chris, for calling in. So, Tricky, tell us, what's your conception of what it means to be white? Can I assume that you're white?
Yeah. I mean, these
Oh,
days I
good.
can identify with whatever I want. But
You're breaking up,
I
Tricky.
oh yeah, I'm not sure how to answer those.
Still breaking up, frozen, if I may say.
Okay, I'm gonna reboot and come back on. If y'all are still here, then I'll join you.
Okay, so I think you're better now, though. Did you change location? So maybe you can just continue. Okay, so he's going to come back. Aha. So let's get back to let's get back to the topic. Chris. So Chris, is this your first time of watching us, Chris?
I've watched you a couple times on YouTube, probably
Let's go.
half a dozen times.
Oh, so thanks for always watching. So at least you will understand that we are non-judgmental here. We're just trying to understand things, That's me. I genuinely want to understand things. I'm asking these questions. They're not bad faith questions, right? Some people might mistake it and say, but no, that's not me. So, Tricky, welcome back to the conversation. So, tell us what defines whiteness? What are the features of whiteness? What are the characteristics of whiteness? What does it mean to be white? You're muted. Can't hear you, Tricky. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't grow up in an environment where I could actually distinguish a difference based on that, if that makes any sense. I don't. I mean, um, there's, I'm so many different ancestries, so maybe I could tell you about potatoes and being Irish. Um, but and I grew up around a bunch of Latinos, so I can tell you about their food. I don't understand the question of what it means to be white, though. I just feel like I'm a human, and I'm not
But
able to distinguish.
you're white. You do refer to yourself as white, right? So what makes you think you're white? What is it that makes you um feel you're white? If I call you a black guy, you probably look at me weird, right? Because obviously. So what's that thing? What are those things that makes you say, okay, this is an acceptable social label for me, for someone to say, oh, that's a white guy, and it's okay.
I think it's just skin tone and environment, cultural environment that places me in that category. And maybe the fact that I can't dance, but there's, John Travolta.
I
There's
can't dance either,
exceptions,
so that's not a point. So go ahead.
but I don't really have an answer for you. I'm sorry.
Hey, Chris is gone. Chris, I really, really want you to come back. Still a lot to talk about. So you grew up around Latinos, right? You grew up around. The Latinos you grew up around? Do you consider them as white, or were they seen socially as white?
They were definitely Latinos. They had their own culture, and it was beautiful. It was so much fun to be around. I mean,
I know they were Latinos,
very
right?
much.
Is Latino, like, is it a racial category or is it a cultural category for you?
I
Oh,
guess
Tricky
racial
is frozen again.
culture.
Tricky, you're frozen again.
Um, you're asking, but you're asking that African Americans here are um,
Tricky, you're frozen. You're
so,
frozen. You're frozen.
I don't know. I really need to talk to help you find that.
Uh, Tricky, I didn't get much of what you said. So if you can, if you when your network is better, you can repeat it out. I'd really appreciate that. And I really wish Chris can call back in. So there's still a lot to talk about. Uh, so okay,
Yep. Um, I think one of the things that I was hoping I could ask Chris was just more so the question around, you know, when for him did he, um, when for him did he become racially aware or racially conscious, right? The question of when was there this hyper consciousness of your skin tone? And the interesting thing is, even like when it comes to I kind of feel like using appropriate language, like would it would it suffice, rather than would it suffice to describe someone as light or light skinned as opposed to dark skinned? But then again, language has been so warped such that, obviously, we try to create like even hardline distinctions. So for instance, someone who's African and lighter, you know what I mean, would not we would find the term light skin appropriate to define
Mm.
them, but not appropriate to define someone like Chris, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the question I was kind of hoping to ask him. Or
So
oh,
he's
even
back. You
Chris
can
is
ask
back.
him a
Hi,
question.
Yeah.
hey, Chris. Sorry, I was just talking to Charles about, wanting to ask you when do you think you um, developed a sense of I don't want to use the word race consciousness because it could mean something somewhat political or even far sinister. But when did you develop this consciousness of your skin tone having some form of social significance?
Like
So
that there was such a thing as white and black and that I was white.
yeah.
Um, Boy, that's an interesting question. So I went to school, elementary school, there were a handful of black kids, and I don't remember thinking of them as different. I would say probably, if I had to guess, and maybe like when I started paying attention to music and when like funk probably came around, and that was referred to as like bro tunes, and where people started to kind of culturally separate things. If I had to really, where I really started to kind of think about it, I would say probably music started to introduce me to a delineation between cultures. And I never really thought about that before. That's the best guess right now. And like, uh, yeah, I think music, because I listened to Prince and The Time and Grandmaster Flash and all that. And again, funk was like called bro tunes. And so around then, but it didn't make me think of like, also like junior high and high school, also like handful of black kids in both those schools. I don't really think of them as different from me, but I mean, obviously it was a difference in skin color.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, and obviously thanks for sharing. Another question I wanted to ask is, do you in your day-to-day life, like, do you ever is there ever a time where you feel you it's is there ever a time where you feel it's expedient for you to um to identify as white, right? Or to, you know what I mean? So say for instance, to make the question easier, you'd say your name, like you'd introduce yourself as Chris, probably, I don't know, 10 to 15 times a day, right? So things about you that are, but in terms of you being white, in what instance do you feel you may have to use that descriptive?
Hmm.
Never
I
did.
have to probably, I'm not sure that I've ever, I mean, felt, right? Air quotes. I'm not sure I've ever felt I have to.
Job application.
I'm not sure if, I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
To be honest, I think you are, because that's I think the question was actually meant to elicit the kind of response, and I think Tricky also just basically answered is and that's the reason why I kind of tried to use the example of your name, for instance, right? Like aspects of your identity that you engage, or it's kind of like common for you to use. So you use your name, you probably use your address, you probably use your I don't know. What else? What else could you know?
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? So when would you feel? And Charles, this is also a question for you too. Like, and what instance do you feel you have to say use your racial identity
Hey,
as
hey,
some
hey,
form
where I
of?
live, we're all black.
So
Don't
you
need to
don't. So
use
you
it.
don't use it. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I guess that answers that. So if so to highlight Charles's question, if I were to, Chris, ship you and Tricky to Scotland or Ireland, and now this is
Oh,
obviously
hell
not to
no.
presuppose that it's not Scotland or Ireland are not diverse, because you do have people of right who are Scottish, but how much of, if you were living in Scotland or Ireland, how much do you think you would be seen as white, or you would use that identity?
You wouldn't, I think, because to your point, you're so homogenous. I
Okay.
think it's,
I,
go ahead.
I would just not be able to understand a single word they were saying. Um, so I might have to rely on Charles. Maybe he's better with other languages or accents than me. Maybe he's not. I'm not sure. But I would be more out of place in Ireland or Scotland because other than like what you hear on TV or whatever, I've had to work. I had to do like global operations in various companies, and that is one of the most difficult accents to understand.
Okay. Now, if I were to use the term, say, white as culture, right?
Can I inject something?
Sure.
Because I think what he says is really interesting. Because I grew up around my grandfather who came here in the 20s. And, he was alive until I was maybe 12 years old. And the company I work for has a factory in Scotland. And when we would be on conference calls, and my grandpa passed away, so like 40 years ago ish. Not even having like other guys on the call in the States wouldn't understand the Scottish guys, and I understood them perfectly. And it has to be because I grew up around my grandpa. So culturally, there was like a connection there. So I think if I went to so my grandpa grew up in Glasgow. If I went to there, I'd have cousins, buying me beers like crazy. I think I'd feel totally at home because I was around my grandfather and I heard stories and I knew his accent and all that. So it's interesting that, is it tricky? So like culturally, he thinks he would not be necessarily feel at home in Ireland. Or if I went to Scotland, I'd be like, man, I'm home.
Yeah, yeah. It's just I don't know what it is. I can understand people from India. I can understand people from China. I can understand people from a little bit France. France is a little bit difficult for me. But Ireland, I was just like, I have no idea what you're saying.
So like to my point, I think it's pretty interesting that he can go to a place that's completely white and feel out of place. And I would go someplace, it's kind of the same, that's completely white and feel completely in place. And, you know, the appearance of the people in both places probably be almost identical.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So would you? So I mean, from what you and Tricky are saying, is that you're obviously highlighting, I guess, the cultural nuances or distinctions between groups that kind of give them their unique identity, be it even the pattern of spoken language, right?
Outside of that,
Yeah.
skin tone doesn't necessarily matter when it comes to relating to somebody. Because, like I said, I could not even understand people from Glasgow. Um, I had a very difficult time doing that. So we had to make it sure that we did most of our communication through text because whatever my brain just didn't comprehend it. But then, like, there's been times where, and I'm not sure if this is totally true, but I have been completely exhausted, and I've had complete conversations in Spanish, and I don't even think I know Spanish. So I mean, I've been around that culture so much
Okay.
that I can totally understand them, even if I may be delusional and out of my mind, tired or whatever.
Okay. So, one question to the both of you. Is there under any situation where you see yourself as a white guy, as a white person?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you give it like a scenario where you see yourself as a white person?
So I think I talked to you about my background and we're kind of very innocent small town. But I think where I learned my lesson was in a rougher area. It wasn't necessarily because it was a black community. It just was, that's where I was, and I thought I could just walk up and ask them like I would anybody else a question on directions, and they proceeded to try to light me on fire. That's where I learned that yeah, my skin color in this area,
Wait,
I kind
like
of stand out.
literally light you on fire, or is that a joke? Like,
No,
were
they
really?
actually, yeah, they actually tried to light me on fire, but that was it was
Sorry,
a
that's
very
crazy.
very bad neighborhood, and I was like a white dot in midnight. Like I stood out. So I could understand
Uh,
where they may have been mistrusting. It's just I came from a very innocent place and thought that was okay. But, so there is
Interesting.
instances where I've learned now that I have to, um, I don't know, not be so. What is the word? Innocent.
Mm, I get that. I get that. So, Chris, same question to you.
Repeat the question for me.
So, are there any instances where you uh, became conscious of the fact that you're a white person?
I would say that mostly the answer would be back when I was, approaching my teen years, and music was referred to, as more of like a color culture than a musical thing. You know what I mean? Like bro tunes or black music. And I was like, huh, okay.
Okay, so Stanley was asking, said, who labeled bro music? Was it your black classmates?
Say that again.
Who labeled the music bro music?
Like my brother's friends, like college kids. So like before Prince hit top 40 and he was like on the college scene,
Mm,
because my brother was older and in college, I got introduced to a lot more music and other stuff, that was, I guess, white kids were listening to before, it hit top 40.
mm. So you saw some kind of distinctions between the sorts of music that appeal to African Americans and the sort of music that appeal to white people, at least in a general sense.
I don't think it necessarily appealed to, I wouldn't have thought of, and I hadn't thought of until now, that it appealed more to white or black people, but the artists were black.
Okay, so white people were producing certain type of music while black people were producing certain types of music, even though anybody could consume them.
I didn't take it that far. You know what I mean? So like again, before like say Prince and Rick James uh, and well, just use those two because they're good guys and popular and known. Before they hit top 40, which is just like all of America. Again, I was referred to as like bro tunes or black music.
Mm,
So
interesting.
yeah, so my brother and his friends who were older referred to it as that, and it was played you know, in bars and things like that, more on the college scene.
So were you listening to these bro music? Like, did they appeal to you or something?
It didn't. I just like the music. I still do. Um, I just like. I still love funk.
Yeah, I got a bass guitar at a very young age, and I've been a fan of Bootsy Collins forever. So just the simplicity. So kind of trying to relate to what you just said.
Mm, that's interesting. So back to Tricky. Tricky, you were saying something the other time that you grew up around Latino people. So in your worldview or in the worldview of people around, were those Latinos, were they regarded as white, or what racial category were they put into?
Um, Latino. I'm definitely Latino. I mean, they liked Selena. They liked their Tejano version of polka music. They made better food than us, definitely. It was just but it was very accepting. It was like we were sharing our cultures. I think they were more sharing their culture with us. We didn't really have a culture to speak of. Um, but no, they definitely had their own thing. And they definitely had their own culture. And they definitely had their own tribalism. But it wasn't like no problem to go hang out with them or whatever. They would teach me their dances, or my best friend was a Latino, and we would go and hang out with his friends, and it was just something different. It wasn't necessarily. It just made it more interesting, I guess. Just having exposure to that. I don't know if I'm answering. I'm kind of rambling. Sorry.
So did they look stereotypically like you? I mean, light skin, or were they a shade darker?
Uh, Darker. Yes.
They were a shade darker. Okay, so it wasn't just the cultural aspect, right? So the culture was also superimposed on having a darker skin tone. So those were the basis for which you could make those distinctions that these are Latino people, right?
Um, Not necessarily, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to explain that. There were some very white Latinos that hung out with us, but then there
Hmm.
was people that exhibited their culture as well. I
So if you
we
if you were interacting with those white Latinos, right, what would you conceive them as racially? The ones that look maybe just exactly like you. What would you conceive of them racially?
They definitely didn't look like me. I would consider them Latino, but I mean they were into the exact same stuff. They were, we were all listening to Rage Against the Machine. We were all listening to the newest Soundgarden album. We were all attempting to skateboard or whatever. Just we were just
Mm,
hanging out. We didn't really. It wasn't the distinction wasn't important. If that makes any
mm.
sense.
But do you consider Latino like a racial category, or do you consider it a cultural category like Scottish, Irish, German? How would you place Latino?
I guess technically it's both. Um, as far as the importance of it, I just don't care enough. As far as the distinction between the racial differences, then the cultural differences are just interesting and fun.
Mm.
Um, and then later in life, I had a friend that was uh, probably the blackest black guy you ever met in your life.
Mm.
But I mean, as far we were just friends. Wasn't The only advantage he had over me is we would go to country and western bars, and the white women would be all over him because they're like,
Mm.
"Oh, black guy," because he was something different. He was something exotic. He was a unicorn at the club. But other than that, there wasn't any difference.
Mm. Interesting. Chris, is is there anything you feel you can add to the sort of questions I asked? I just asked Tricky.
Um, well, I think yours was kind of more in reference to him growing up with Latino kids, right?
Mm.
I mean, my experience was it was like probably, you know, 90% white kids, probably 6 or 8% black kids, and then some Asian, Middle Eastern mixed in. So it wasn't like it was closer to, kind of standard demographics in the States, leaning towards more white. So I think I had a kind of a mix of people I was around.
Mm.
So kind of no presuppositions, or if that answers your question.
Okay, so I think the the most pointed response I've gotten so far in terms of defining what white is, coming from Chris, which is sort of close to what I got on Twitter today. Someone made that comment today. Maybe I'll just read it. So when I asked what does it mean to be white, he said this. So he said it's a concept made by white Anglo-Saxons to identify themselves. Originally, it mainly included English, Northern, Western Europeans, but later they accepted Italians and other Europeans as white as well. What do you think about that comment?
I think that's more related to imperialism than Caucasianism, if that makes any sense. That's, I mean, there was a supremacist attitude, not just towards blacks, but towards all other cultures, where they were just various European countries were just taking over everybody. And I think maybe that would relate more towards that way. That's my guess. That's feel free to demolish that theory, but that's my first thought that comes to my head.
So, Chris, what do you think about that comment?
That sounds more to me like something that would have been said in the early kind of immigration years of the United States, like more on the East Coast, where, kind of Italians and Irish were kind of later to the party and more discriminated against. And maybe because they were more visually identifiable, like Irish, more red hair, super white skin, Italians be more olive colored, and also probably, segregating themselves, culturally and in neighborhoods. And this is just a guess based on what you said. Sounds more like, like if you, and just hearing, this is more of a topic of discussion in the last, say 5 to 10 years, and referring to something that's pretty, this is like ridiculously oversimplifying, but watching a movie like Gangs in New York, where it made a representation of kind of that kind of thing, where the different segregated white cultures kept their own identities. That's what that sounds like to me.
So it sounds like to me that this guy is talking about, this was the earliest conception of what whiteness was. I mean, in America, right? It mainly was referring to the Anglo-Saxon, Northwestern Europeans, right? As the dominant class or the dominant racial group in America, right? The Italians and the Greeks and the others were not quite white enough till maybe later on, right? So
Yeah.
in that sense, it's a it's as groups get upgraded, they get admitted into the class of being white, right? So the Italians were admitted into being white. Even the Arabs, I know there was a time the Arabs, they had to fight for the right to be considered white. I think there was a court case that actually stipulated that Arabs could be regarded to as white, right? So it seems like it's a class thing where people, different groups get admitted into that class at different times in the history of the US. And it's interesting to note that you mentioned something about the Irish being much more redheaded and even lighter skinned, right? And still being discriminated against. One would think that the lightest of the white people would be at the top of the hierarchy. I mean, I've heard so many so many jokes of which redheaded people are the butt of the jokes, right? So it seems that it's there's an amount of skin color in there, right? But it's more like a class thing mostly, like a class thing superimposed on skin tone, right? And grading people based on that.
You know,
Just an aside to that, which really doesn't help. It's just I'm just chiming in with nonsense. But my wife was a Spaniard, a very Spaniard, and her mom was very, very Spanish from Spain, and was very racist against Latino countries, which I found amusing. Because they share a lot of the same genealogy, but that's not anything for conversation. I just thought that was interesting, kind of to go along with what you just said.
you know what, Charles? It's actually very interesting that you and that gentleman basically highlight the class element of um, of the racial term white. But here's the thing: when you even look at the word or the term white in its proper context, which is kind of more in context of art, which is kind of where it started from, right? It's in context of art, colors, right? You would find that in the I think it was between the fifth, sixth century, like kind of like up to the Middle Ages. There was this obviously when Christianity was prevalent in Western European societies, right? Um, the color white was uh, symbolic of purity and holiness. So it was even in its inception a a I don't want even in its inception it was a color that denoted some form of class, elitist concept or identifier. And so if you look at like the earliest paintings in Western Europe, a lot of times with the elites, and this was kind of like a deviation, like they used to uh, get the color palette closer to how the person looked phenotypically, so they weren't coloring people
Some of
white.
that was to cover up they would use white makeup to cover up the fact that they had syphilis. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so, okay, maybe that was going on as well, but I think like with the prevalence of Christianity and this push to purity, they could see a change, and I think Michel Pasteur in his book on colors, black and white, he touches on this kind of like deviation whereby they started to now paint some of their elites in like white, like actually use the color white on their images, and that was to denote a sense of like purity, like elitist purity. Well, where did Charles go? Yeah, so and I think part of that was actually bought in by the the Christian colonists of the United States into some form of racial identity. Obviously, you could also look at the Enlightenment as well. So I think there was that central theme of white as pure that was basically now adapted by Western European nations into this classist racial identity.
Probably evolved from the more elites weren't the ones out there in the
Of
fields getting
course,
a tan.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
true, true,
yeah.
yeah. There was that too as well. So in a sense, I could see from Charles's from the comment gotten off of that, whoever posted it on Facebook, that theme. Because then again, what happens is that people almost forget the ethnic elements that were also happening in Western Europe, like with the Irish English dichotomy, right? You kind of forget that that was kind of all tied in, and everything was brought into the U.S. colonies, and there was those ethnic dimensions didn't just go overnight. and are still kind of here with us. So yeah, Charles, did you catch a bit of
Yeah,
what I
I
said?
caught the earliest part.
Yeah. So I was just basically saying that, within the context of the tweet you read, that a lot of times that we forget, like, there was a huge ethnic undertone
Mm,
going on in Europe then, that basically created the need for a distinction, right? A distinction of group, a distinction of who were considered like Christian, Protestant, white, and who weren't,
mm,
right? And then over time, and I think Theodore R. Wells touches in his book, The Creation of the White Race,
mm,
basically saying that, you basically have to understand what white people are in more of like a political social formation,
mm,
because that's kind of how you understand how different groups were grafted into this white race, because now it was more so about controlling the labor of en masse of the people, of the enslaved African indigenous people, right, by creating this numerical superiority force. So that's kind of the gist.
okay. So if I get what you're saying is that, pre-existing ethnic categorizations, right, was the foundation for what later got translated into racial categorizations, right? So the English and the Irish were two separate ethnic groups. The
Hmm.
English thought themselves as being better than the Irish, right? Now they come in contact with other groups. They take that similar idea and extrapolate it to other groups as well. So now you have Indians, right? You have
Hmm.
Africans, and they see them as also distinct groups, and then they place them on a scale, right? On a hierarchical scale to say, well, we the English are at the top, right? The Irish can come next, then maybe another group, right? So over time, those sort of ethnic differences becomes codified
Yeah.
along the lines of skin tone, right?
Yeah.
If 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 I'm getting what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah. The general gist is kind of understanding like how ideas evolve, right? So ideas of class, for instance, borrowed by certain elitist group in England, Spain, and Germany, for instance, because the idea of class was obviously tied into within this theological hierarchy, because Christianity was the prevailing ontology, okay, of that society, and how within the idea of Christianity, white as pure. You see what I'm saying? Especially purity within the sense of, and then again, you get into the politics of Protestant Catholic dichotomy, the English society being more Protestant and the Irish being Catholic, right? So there were pockets of distinctions, ethnic distinctions, capsulated in religious thought. There was just a lot going on, and then imagine now bringing that baggage into the U.S. colonies, right? It's just kind of like, think of it more as a ways of knowing that the English Europeans brought in. But when they came in, they obviously brought in those certain ethnic prejudices from the old country. But for them to be able to either colonize and steal the labor of what we would deem like the minority African group, they needed to expand their numbers. So now it was more of like a political move whereby, okay, you're no longer Irish, you have to be grafted, even though even though we don't like you, but to serve the longer purpose, like we'll graft you into this category called white. So you have to leave your Irishness, right? Leave that aside, join this racial entity called white. And then they did that with certain, even within Canadian immigration, you see the same theme, whereby in Canada, they weren't letting people from Russia and Eastern European nations come in, right? So, but over time, no, everybody, we grafted them into this racial identity called white. So the way to understand it, and I think Theodore W. Wells, he may make such a brilliant argument, is to understand what white is as a quantitative political social control force.
So I think I I can draw sort of like a parallel. Let's come back to Africa. Let's come to Nigeria and draw like a parallel, right? Nigeria, there are over 250 ethnic groups, right? And the country is basically broken into four geopolitical zones,
Yeah.
right? Six geopolitical zones, but
Mhm.
it's mostly northern Nigeria, southern Nigeria, the two major zones, and then you have the northeast, the northwest, and you have the eastern part, you have the western part, and you have the midwest part, right? Now, certain tribes dominate each of these regions, right? So in the north, it's the Hausa Fulani, in the west, it's the Yoruba, in the east, is the Igbo. People up north will look at people in the east and say, you are all Igbos, even
Mhm.
though there are literally hundreds of tribes there, right?
Yeah.
They'll look at those in the west as you're all Yorubas, even though there are literally hundreds of tribes there. Those in the east and in the west will look up north and say they're all Hausa Fulani, right?
Mhm.
Also play out in politics. Within the eastern region itself, there's going to be infighting. They're always infighting, right? But they would always provide, they will always put a united front if it now becomes a contest between east and north, right? So the east would put a united front to say, oh, after all, we're all easterners, we're all southerners, right?
Yeah.
We need to do we need to act this way against the north. So
Mhm.
at every level, there's always some level of categorization. There's always some level of how will I put it? You know, like the Arabs will say, they say, I am my neighbor, I am my neighbor against the world, um, um, and I am my brother against my neighbor. As in, the closer the kinship becomes, the more you're able to, like, you and your community can fight another community, right? But when it comes to your family and the community, you're going to take the side of your family, right? And when it comes, so those alliances form at different levels, right? So
Yeah.
that's sort of the way I'm seeing it. Stanley is asking, so religion created race in America, but I think you're missing what Oge is
What
saying.
am I saying? Yeah. Stanley's always missing the point, but
Yeah.
that's okay.
So the point is, I think this is multifaceted, right?
Yeah.
Because Stanley says the distinctions were economic, which I also think too.
Of course.
That you know, there are economic aspects to it. There are political aspects to it. There's social aspects to it, right? There are so many aspects to it, and it just comes together to create this categorization called whiteness, right?
Yeah.
So Stanley is saying, so Nigerian ethnicity has what to do with whiteness. Please tie this together. Stanley, please stop. As in, this comment is actually infuriating because you can't tell me that you're missing the point of
The
what I'm trying
point.
to say.
That's Stanley.
You really can't
Anyways,
tell me that you're missing the
it's
point.
all good.
You get.
So,
So of course there are economic aspects to it. With
so
Many people have always posited that part of the reason for slavery wasn't really a racial angle. It was more and more driven by economics, right? It
yeah.
was trade, it was greed, right? And it was easier to bring people from outside that don't know the terrain, they don't know the layout, and they look physically distinct from you, so you can easily track them down if they try to run away, right?
Yeah.
So of course, there are economic aspect to it. There are also religious aspects to it. There are political aspects to it. But to look at all that and say, do you mean that religion caused racism in America?
No.
Doesn't make
Yeah.
that sense.
The what again? What I would. I mean, I could maybe. I'll probably share some of my resources with you. But one of the things, Charles, to really understand that when if you're looking at the words in isolation themselves, if you're looking at the words white or black in isolation, you're looking at color words. Color words only function within color words historically only function within an artistic purview, right? So white is not a 16th century concept. The ancient Greeks were using the color, right? but you ask yourself, well, what were they using it on? Oh, expression of ideas, symbological ideas, and then you see how those ideas in the creation of an ideology of Christianity inherited by the Western European group, so the English, and then trying to understand what ideas did they form of that color in the sense of trying to establish this idea of godliness or purity, and what did that mean to them? What did that how did they establish that idea in opposition to others who they saw as either not of the same denomination or who were not of the faith, right? Who were either Muslims or heathens, right? So the medieval world is such it's a fascinating place if you try to understand like some of the prevalent ideas that was going on within that context, and then understand how those ideas were funneled through the Enlightenment, right? Oh, sorry, came to the colonies of the United States in the 16th century, and then also funneled through the Enlightenment. So the idea here was, if you understand that people who already had ethnic differences in their home country, they already knew that, oh, the Irish, are, we see them as less than because of dot 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 dot, right? And then you understand the history of the US colonies in terms of like that, the creation of legal apparatus that were meant to kind of hardline or codify race, right? And then to see how different groups at different points in time were grafted into this homogeneous term, because the individuals that came into the colonies, 1607, 1614, the European groups that first migrated, they came under their national banners. They came as
Mhm.
English, Christian, or Protestant. So
Or
this is not
Spanish
us.
or
Yeah, it's not new.
Portuguese.
Yes. So to now see how, oh, so how did they go from being English, Portuguese, all this to just being this homogenous term called white? Then you now start to understand how certain ideas inherited from, you know their certain ideas inherited from either a religious um, 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 lens were actually, filtered in to create this homogeneous um, thinking or identity called the white race, and how that also created inclusion exclusion criteria, and how people over time who were not white was now seen as white.
Makes sense to me. I mean, that theory makes sense to me. I think that the evolution of the what it means to be white, right? There's that evolution over time, taking its roots from ethnic differences, and then when it coming to a place where it's just like maybe a group of black people, like let's and this is going to piss Stanley off. It's going to piss Stanley off. So get ready to be pissed off again because I'm going to use another Nigerian example. Say as a Nigerian, you're back here in Nigeria. There are always ethnic tensions, the Yorubas and the Igbos and the Hausas, right? But when those three groups meet in a place like in the United States of America, right, they are most likely going to form a united
Yeah,
front
United.
as
Yeah,
Nigerians,
yeah,
right? As opposed to relating with Ghanaians, right? So even though they have, you know, ethnic differences, they can form a united front against other groups. And Nigerians usually even say this, that they are the best black group in
hmm
the best Africans, right? So when you now have different African groups in a particular place, in my mind, the hierarchy for Africans is Nigerians and then Ghanaians and then maybe some other. So if you wanted to form a racial category based on blackness and the Nigerians are the dominant, racial group, it's very possible for the Ghanaians to not be seen as black, right?
yeah,
Then over time, they can be, grafted into
drafted
what
in.
it means to be black, while the Kenyans and the rest are still seen as not black enough, right?
Yeah,
But you can see that those things, there is a social context to it. There's probably an economic context to it,
It's
and also a political
yeah,
context.
it's mostly political, Charles, because the idea of politics is more to acquiesce power, right? I mean, if you either you can either acquiesce power, quote unquote, numerically,
Mm,
right? Get a bunch of people. I mean, if you have one person is easily, how do I put it? One person is easily, can easily be oppressed by 10 people. It's a
mhm,
numerical advantage, right? Or
mhm,
you get power through, you know, politics of trying to gather economic resources,
mhm,
right? So to really dial it down in terms of, things that we call black race or white race, these are numeric quantitative construct that have limited to no qualitative value, because for you to get the quality in it, you would have to go into the ethnic identity,
mm,
right? So that's why when you ask someone what makes you white, or they would mostly, and anyone will mostly pivot to, oh, my ancestors are from dot 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 dot. Okay, so then it's like, okay, fine, how then do I really understand this white, you know this white construct, or this white thing?
yeah, sure. So I think Atmos, do you have anything further to add to this conversation so that we can see how we can bring it to a close? Well, at least there something seems much more clearer to me now in terms of defining what white is. But I'll leave that for my cousin, right? So Atmos, you go. Oh, we can't hear you. You can't hear you, Atmos. Atmos, your mic is muted, so try muting it and talking again. Still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Okay, so what are your final thoughts of it? Okay, let me ask you this question. Why do you think that people struggled so much to answer the question, what does it mean to be white? I mean, there were a lot of responses on Twitter, and people were basically just throwing their hands up in the air like, I really don't know what this is. Why do you think there was that um, difficulty, if at all?
I think I think if I were to take a broad swipe at it, one of the things, one of the first possible explanations I will have is, you know white situated within its proper historical context as the standard, right, as the generic. So if you understand it, if you see it, because that's how it was basically meant to be. It was meant to be the standard. So for something that is seen as the generic, people would often take that identity for granted. I mean, and I think you and I, we've basically touched on it. It's the same way, being in Nigeria, you take for granted your skin color. It has no meaning to you, right? But then when you juxtapose that with the historical atrocities and done on done at the premise of whiteness, and this is kind of where we get the whole white privilege from, of creating laws that you know you can you can to a certain degree understand or see why there's some form of ambivalence with this identity. However, there's also there's also the other side to it, which is if you notice that whenever individuals use whiteness or being white as kind of like an aggressive identity, you normally see it in an extremist form, right? So people
Mm,
will say, "Oh, us, the white race." You already know what you're dealing with. You're dealing with someone with an extremist view of their racial identity. So, in a sense, it was historically seen as a standard, and on the other hand, it's seen as this extremist ideological um, subscription or identity base
mm,
that individuals who who want to tap into some form of purity or whatever they utilize, right? And then I think there is the third side of it, which is the side of individuals who don't they don't really it's not they don't really think about it as much as people think they do. Now I can't suggest, I mean, the why of it. So I think a lot of the people that you and I will encounter in terms of posing the question, I think most of them will fall under this category. And I think from their responses you see, it's like, well, I guess like it's something people call me, and
mm.
you know, that's
Never really thought about it.
I've never really thought about it, right? I've never really thought about it.
Now it's just like asking me, what does it mean to be black
To be
in
black,
Nigeria,
yeah,
right? I'm
you
like,
just
I don't know. I'm just yeah. I got that response a lot. People were like, well, I'm just white, as in, I don't know. I'm
yeah.
just right.
Charles, there was a the one of the very interesting insights I've gotten was there was this guy in my jujitsu class, a
Mm,
good friend of mine who I was talking to, and I asked him because I was kind of trying to do it as a gotcha moment because up until that point I'd never really found anyone who could actually answer it convincingly. And I asked him, I was like, "Oh, you know what? Why? What makes you white? Or why do you call yourself white?" And his answer to the effect of, "Well, I honestly don't know. I can't speak to that, but I can tell you what makes me someone of Polish ancestry,
mhm,
right? I can tell you specifically things around that about, you know, my food, my culture, and stuff like that." And I think what you get is for individuals racialized as white who fit in this like third, what I would term to be like, you know, majority of people I've met, they tend to filter, they tend to answer more from an ancestry point of view.
mm.
So I think it's a hard thing for individuals to really defy.
Mm. Well, thank you very much, okay, for your thoughts. Thank you, Tricky, and thank you, Chris. I wish you were here to give your final thoughts. So, for me, it seems very interesting that, from what I've gleaned so far, that white is a sort of a rigid category per se that is almost essentialist in
Yeah.
terms of um, wanting it to be pure, um, purely European descent, mostly Northern European descent, right? Because there's actually no other category. There's actually no other racial category that you have such strict standards for. Let's take black, for example, right? A black person can be as dark as I am, to be as light as Meghan Markle, right? And if you were to even take our genetics, there might be much more variation between myself and herself than between any two white guys, right? So in that sense, right, it is seen as, other Latinos as well can be of any shade, they can be of any culture, they can be of, but it seems that to be white, you have to be very, very specific, and which to me highlights how this is sort of problematic for me, right? I posted on Twitter. I said the definition of what it means to be black is racist. The definition of what it means to be white is racist. And in fact, the whole concept of race itself is racist. And why I say that is the current conception of what it means to be black in America still is derived from the one drop rule, right? So if you have one drop of African ancestry, you're black. You're basically black, right? While for the other side, for you to be white, you have to just be basically European. You have there's no admixture. You have to be European, and that's the standard that's still transcribed into what it means to be white and what it means to be black today, right? And you know, it's a category that exists, which is not a very useful category in my opinion. Or maybe that's because I'm Nigerian. I'm talking from an African perspective, right? Because if you look at how we in Africa, how we determine ethnicity, right, is usually, for most of Africa, is usually patrilineal, right? So if your father is of a certain ethnicity, right, then you it doesn't matter what your mother is, right? So like us, if if a kid if an African man has a child with a white woman, the child will be seen as African principally. If it was the other way around, if it was the father that was white and the mother is black, nah, they might want to see you more as what your father is, right? So in my worldview, right, I think that a white man having a kid with a black woman and saying, oh, that kid cannot be white, that kid has to be black, it seems sort of problematic for me. This whole racial categorization thing, it just seems sort of problematic because it's basically essentializing whiteness to say whiteness is the standard of what it means to be pure, of what it means to be genetically, almost genetically homogeneous. So I hope this stream has been fruitful. At least it has been for me. At least I have been able to get a better understanding of what it means to be white, right? Most people know what it means to be black, but nobody, uh, principally, many people don't know what it means to be white at this point. So,
Charles, can I quickly add something
yeah, so the
that
final thoughts to you,
yeah,
and then we'll be done.
my final thought is, in a society, that I live in a society like Canada, and to the and even the United States, and
Mm,
yes, Stanley, I do visit the United States. Is that
you don't
one
say.
one would think that at this point of our history, that the fact that we're so inundated with diversity, right? We can already reconcile diversity as norm, such that you don't need to put people in boxes,
Mm,
right? Because people don't just present as one thing. Ancestry,
mhm,
we're all a composite. So I I think of it more as, w- we have the opportunity to reimagine human diversity, and to reimagine in such a way that we create more functional ways to describe, or so not describe, to understand populations, such that there isn't a
mhm,
need, right? There isn't a need, and I use air quotes for any form of description or categorization. So I always think
mhm,
about that, and in thinking about that, I think about what it means to be ethnic, right? Ethnicity. Ethnicity simply is your birthright citizenship. So a person born in the United States, to me, is simply a citizen of the United States. I'll give a concession to Stanley because I know this makes him happy. He's simply an American, right? They, there really is, there, there really, there really is no need to
You lots in
Hispanicize.
Canada are not Americans.
We're not
You're
American.
something
Yeah,
else.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I told Stanley I'm American. Tell the FBI to come knock on my door. Anyways, So the idea is, even the concept of white doesn't even fit the ethnic parameters. Because if you say white is ethnic, the
Exactly.
conversation is, where is it ethnic to,
Hmm.
right? If you say black is ethnic, where is it ethnic to? Okay. But if you just said, I'm an American, that suffices, right? Because we
Hmm.
know, okay, fine, you were born, and in understanding diversity, you can reconcile that. Oh, an American can look in
Any sort of way.
diversity. You know what I mean? So, but
Hmm.
obviously, with racial identity, there's also the politics to it too. So, but at the end of the day, I have said, since I deracialized myself, there's no one coming to, Canadian police haven't come to knock on my door to say, why don't you self-identify as black?
Hmm.
So it's, yeah, people are free to identify however they please. So
So I think there was one point I missed making, which is how we Africans, how we see whiteness, right? What's our conception of whiteness? To us, whiteness is synonymous with culture, with foreign, so if you're in the US, if you're in the Western world, you're white. Whether your skin tone is black, whether you're even Asian. So it's more a geographical, cultural thing for us. So someone like Stanley, if he comes to Nigeria and people hear him speak, they'll be like, "Oh, who is that white guy talking?" Right?
yeah, actually, Stanley,
They
that's a good point for you to understand
know,
too. Yeah, when
yeah, they do know that he has black skin. They can make that distinction that he's African American, right? But the generic term they would use for African Americans too would be white, right? So a few days ago, no, I think some months ago, we're watching something on the TV, and my kid sister, she walked in, she was like, "Why do white people always like behaving like this?" Do you know who she was talking about on the TV? She was talking about an African American woman. She was referring to the behavior of an African American woman on TV, but she said, "Why do white people always behave like this?" But that's our conception of whiteness. Whiteness is foreign. Whiteness is what you find in the West. So anything in the West is white, right? So it's not really a function of the skin color, right? It's more the culture, how you speak, how you dress, how you are, which also ties to what you were saying about, oh, okay, country specific, ethnicity specific to countries, right? So I think we Africans have a better conception of what it means to be white than you lots in the West. So that's it for the show. Thank you very much, guys, and I will catch you in another live stream. So it's bye for now. Bye again.